All right. Welcome to the public meeting for NRCS's draft watershed plan environmental assessment for the Matanzas Creek Dam Rehabilitation Project. My name is Aaron Fulton. I'm the principal engineer in the design group and also the project manager for the Matanzas Creek project. You'll also be hearing from Richard Rivas, environmental compliance specialist from NRCS later in the presentation. Today's presentation is really focused on obtaining public input for the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, process for NRCS. Sonoma Water is subject to CEQA and additional permitting requirements, and we'll be doing that at a later time. But I thought I'd just throw it out there for anybody who was wondering what the next step was in terms of compliance. Today's meeting is being recorded, so by continuing, you agree that your voice may be recorded, and then we're actually going to be publishing it on the project website. So if you have any problems, door's right there, and you can see the presentation on the website. All right, so before we get started, I just wanted to make sure everybody had a chance to get some comment cards. You could have picked them up at the door, or they're also at your table. Feel free to jot down any questions that you might have during the presentation. We are going to allow about 2 to 3 questions after significant agenda items if people have questions, but trying to keep those to mostly clarifying questions, and we'll take time at the end of the presentation to answer any more involved or in-depth questions that folks may have. With that said, if you do have any comments or questions, our real focus today is that we want to make sure that you get those down in writing. You can submit them either at the door when you leave, or you can submit them to comments.ca.watersheds@usda.gov, or you can send them in the mail so long as you have them post-dated by the deadline. The project website, if you go ahead and visit, you'll see there's more information about this presentation, all the Plan EA, the supporting documents, and the deadlines for submitting comments can all be found on the project website. So please take the opportunity to visit it. There's a lot of information on there. Don't be overwhelmed. The first link, which is the draft Plan EA, is probably the most important. In today's presentation, we're going to briefly touch on the Matanzas Creek Dam, give a quick background of its history and its importance. Then we're going to discuss the project need. Why do we even need a project? And then Richard's going to come talk about the purpose of today's meeting, the NEPA process. I'll quickly describe some of the alternatives that are in the draft Plan EA. We'll talk about the National Environmental Policy Act process. We'll quickly review project effects of the action alternatives. We'll talk about schedule, and hopefully if we get through all that, we'll have some time at the end if folks have questions that they want to ask. All right. So before we even talk about Matanzas Creek, it's really like we can't even talk about Matanzas Creek unless you understand that it's really one piece of a larger flood infrastructure project, and that's the Central Sonoma Watershed Project, also known as the CSWP. This infrastructure was constructed in the 1962 to 1968. It includes 26 miles of channel improvements, shown there in pink. 3 downtown culverts, so 2 barrels covering Santa Rosa Creek and 1 for Matanzas, 2 diversion structures near Santa Rosa Creek or Spring Lake, and then 4 large detention basins. One's Piner Creek Reservoir, Brush Creek Reservoir, Santa Rosa Creek, also known as Spring Lake, and then subject of today's meeting, Matanzas Creek Reservoir. The primary message to really take away from this slide is that Matanzas is just part of the CSWP. The entire project was developed to protect the city of Santa Rosa from recurring and damaging floods in the 1940s and 1950s. All of those floods were generated from Santa Rosa Creek sub-watershed, which is shown there and outlined in blue. So now we've had a chance to just talk about how Matanzas fits into that broader flood control infrastructure that protects the city of Santa Rosa. Let's talk about the project site itself. So just about 2 miles up the road in Bennett Valley, identified here with the red triangle, near the intersection of Grange and Bennett Valley Road, is the Matanzas Creek Dam. Probably no one here has been to it. It's kind of off the side of the road, out of sight, out of mind. It was constructed as part of the CSWP in 1964 through the construction of a 95-foot tall earthen embankment dam. It provides about 1,440 acre-feet of flood storage. The main components of the project that you'll recognize, at least from this image and future graphics, is a principal spillway inlet structure. So this is where the majority of your flows enter and go through the reservoir. And then we also have a vegetated auxiliary spillway which wraps around the main embankment and goes back down into Matanzas Creek. Quick image tour of the project site. the image on the left is looking towards Annandale, so sort of towards the north. You see the downstream embankment on your left, the upstream embankment or the reservoirs on your right. You'll also see the principal spillway inlet structure. So this is where flows go into the reservoir for release. And then the auxiliary spillway is kind of off in the distance. You can see it with some parked cars here. Image on the upper right-hand side shows a view looking up towards the actual reservoir itself. You can see that same principal spillway inlet structure. And on the downstream side, you can see where that principal inlet structure actually comes out and releases flows. The image on the left is actually that auxiliary spillway. It's hard to make out, but you can see here there's a line going through the vegetation. That's actually a about 2 foot wide concrete weir or sill that's buried at grade, so it doesn't stick up above the ground. And then the image on the right is looking down that vegetated auxiliary spillway. Note there isn't any rock slope protection, no concrete lining, nothing. This spillway is entirely vegetated. There's really nothing stopping erosion from happening if you get a large flood event. So looking at those images, I don't see anything as a civil engineer that would make me go, oh my God, we need a project here. Something's wrong, something needs to be done. And so to get to that question, why we're here, why we need a project, I'll just bring to your attention that in 2016, NRCS completed a statewide assessment of all the dams for which they participated in constructing. That initial assessment at Matanzas Creek Dam identified that that auxiliary spillway, that vegetated spillway, activates in as little as like the 22-year event. Originally, it was designed so that it shouldn't activate in about the 100-year event. So huge discrepancy. So trying to get an idea of exactly what that means. The graphic on the right gives you a representation of what's happening at the reservoir. So each line represents flows leaving Matanzas Creek anywhere from the 2-year to the 500-year event. For the 2, the 5, and the 10, you can see sort of approaches about 1,200 CFS, so cubic feet per second, leaving the reservoir. That's about as much as the principal spillway can convey. Can't push down any more than about 1,200 CFS. By the time you get to that 25-year event, or in purple, you see a subtle yet abrupt increase in discharge, and that's actually the auxiliary spillway itself activating. So flows have gotten so high that the principal spillway is no longer conveying what it needs to keep up, and so that auxiliary spillway is activating. That wasn't supposed to happen in the original design until about a 100-year flood event. So as you can see right now, during the 100-year event, which is in orange, you're more than doubling flow that's exiting Matanzas Creek and eventually making its way down to the city of Santa Rosa. So bottom line, there was an initial deficiency identified, and we also understand that the reservoir itself doesn't provide the same level of flood protection that we might have thought it did when it was originally designed. So what did Sonoma Water and NRCS do? Well, we requested technical and financial assistance from NRCS. They hired a consultant to do a comprehensive assessment that looked at many, many things. And that comprehensive assessment is essentially where we're at today. They're done with their work. They developed a draft plan, which is proposing some modifications to the structure itself. They looked at a whole suite of things, everything from the existing conditions of the dam, geologic investigations of the spillway, soil mechanics, or actually modeling of the embankment, how they performed during a seismic event. And the conclusion of all this work, which was staggering, and over the course of a couple of years, is that we did confirm that one primary deficiency is that the auxiliary spillway does in fact activate more frequently than current dam safety criteria allows. On top of that, we did morphologic modeling of that spillway and determined that it is in fact susceptible to erosion. So those large flow events that do occur, that do activate, we will see erosion and rapid erosion and potentially discharge of additional flows down to the city of Santa Rosa than originally anticipated. Two other items that were identified as deficiencies that were identified in this comprehensive assessment was that the dam doesn't have enough sediment capacity for an additional 50 years. So for a federal investment for a dam like this, you need to at least be able to demonstrate that you've got enough sediment capacity for it to last 50 years without having to do any sort of maintenance. And so we don't quite make that. We currently have about 23 years of sediment capacity remaining in the reservoir before we would need to do something. And the fourth and final, which is important, is that through that embankment stability modeling, we determined that it is in fact susceptible to seismic-induced liquefaction and deformation. So we're close to the Rogers Creek Fault. If the big one let loose at Rogers Creek Fault, we would expect to see some damage of the reservoir, especially if it was full. And now I'm going to go ahead and pass off the presentation to Richard Rivas at NRCS, who's going to start talking about how those deficiencies lead to a project purpose and need.
My name is Richard. I'm mainly doing the environmental compliance part of the and assisting the sponsor with this project. I moved forward. So one of the first foundational things we work with or try to establish is the purpose and need. And so typically, we always need a purpose and need to establish for the NEPA process and for our watershed projects. And so the purpose and need in this project, Aaron talked a lot about, overlapped with me on this, but this is to bring the Matanzas Creek Dam into compliance with NRCS California Division of Safety of Dam Standards and continue to provide flood protection and sediment reduction downstream of Matanzas Dam in the most efficient manner. So the need would be to meet NRCS and DSOD standards in this, and again, Aaron went over this, but vegetated auxiliary spillway activates very routinely, I guess the word is, every 25-year event. The auxiliary spillway is susceptible to erosion. There's available sediment storage capacity is less than 50 years. The embankment is susceptible to liquefaction, deformation during design and seismic events. So during this, I'm just jumping in here a little bit, but we're going to go over the purpose of the meeting and the purpose of the EA as well. So NRCS is basically partnering with the sponsor and implementing the Small Watershed Program. And this is tied to the Watershed Protection, Flood Protection Act of 1985 or 1954. So anytime, typically because we have federal funds involved, this triggers the National Environmental Policy Act, and that means we have to assess the effects of our actions. And so NEPA that's why we have to comply with NEPA. And part of what we produce for NEPA is a draft watershed plan environmental assessment. And this has been prepared and obviously is currently in public review. So the purpose of the meeting is to provide interested parties information on the project, including alternatives considered, results of the environmental assessment, and to answer questions, solicit comments of the draft EA. Just wanted to describe another important part of the process, and that's establishing alternatives or reviewing alternatives. And alternatives are obviously an important part of general NEPA, our environmental review, but it's also part of our program watershed requirements. So because this is a dam rehabilitation, we have certain alternatives that are required. And typically, well, not typically, but the required alternatives to review are the federal decommissioning alternative, non-structural alternative, the no action alternative, which is not what would be the effects if we didn't do the project, and then rehabilitation alternatives. So we evaluated these alternatives and we decided to move forward with our further assessing our no federal action alternative and the rehabilitation alternatives that Aaron's going to talk about. So,
any questions for Richard about the NEPA process or where we are? Right, hearing none. We'll dive into development or description of the alternatives that are in the draft Plan EA. First and foremost, to comply with the deficiencies identified, there were seismic deficiencies and sediment capacity deficiencies. So every single alternative that we're about to go over, there's just 3 of them. They all include some component that is going to rectify those vulnerabilities. So the first thing is you'll see seismic buttresses on the downstream and upstream side of the embankment. And then you're actually going to see sediment removal through the heart of the reservoir to the tune of about 170,000 cubic yards of material. So it's a large effort, but Those two components are on every single alternative, and we'll speak later to what that means in terms of overall impacts, but just wanted to point that out. That's really where the alternatives start to be different from one another. That's where the similarities stop, I should say. Alternative one takes a unique tact in that it actually raises the auxiliary spillway by 5 feet. So we eke out a little bit more storage than what's currently there. But instead of ensuring that the auxiliary spillway doesn't activate, it takes a different tack, which is let's line the whole thing with concrete. So let's line the entire 200-foot wide auxiliary spillway from the crest here all the way down to where it meets Matanzas Creek, and install a still-in basin for additional energy dissipation. This approach would slightly increase flood storage to about a 25-year, 24-hour event. That's substantially less than the original design. However, it is more than existing conditions. But in short, this alternative would more or less keep the hydrologic function and the level of flood protection provided by Matanzas the same as under existing conditions. So not a huge improvement, but it would scratch a little bit back. Overall cost of this alternative is pretty high, about $44 million. That's for design and construction. Gets better from there, so hold your breath. Alternative two, you'll note the same two project elements, seismic buttresses and sediment removal, upstream and downstream and through the heart of the reservoir. Alternative 2 and 3 really take different approaches than alternative 1. The approach is to actually increase your storage so that you don't activate that auxiliary spillway at all during your design event. So in this case, for alternative 2, we would raise the dam crest by 3.4 feet. We'd raise the auxiliary spillway crest by about 7.4 feet. And then we'd regrade the entire auxiliary spillway to just a constant 200-foot wide width. This alternative would increase overall flood storage to somewhere near about a 50-year, 24-hour event. So substantial improvement in terms of flood storage than existing conditions, but not quite to where we were when we originally designed the project. Overall cost for this alternative is less than the full lining or alternative 1. Costs come in at about $30 million for design and construction. And then we have alternative 3. So note the same seismic buttresses, downstream, upstream, and then sediment removal through the heart of the reservoir. In this instance, we would take it up a notch, so a little bit better than alternative 2 in terms of flood storage. We'd raise the crest of the dam by 7.4 feet. We'd raise the auxiliary spillway by about 11.4 feet, regrade the auxiliary spillway to that same continuous 200-foot wide width, and this would result in a pretty drastic increase in overall flood storage at the site. We should be able to actually hold back about a 100-year, 24-hour event storm. So this is in alignment with what was originally designed back in the 1950s. Overall cost for this project for the alternative 3 comes in at around $32 million for design and construction. Any questions about the alternatives? This is usually where it gets exciting. Brian.
What is the regraded auxiliary spillway?
So the regraded auxiliary spillway would be more or less the same as what it is now. So it'd be revegetated with grass, but it would be vegetated. It would look very similar to what it is now, which is we would increase the dimensions so that it's a constant 200-foot wide width. You'll see when you get up around the corner, so this green element is the auxiliary spillway. When you get like right in here, just below the crest and down here, you're a little narrower than 200 feet, and 200 feet would allow us to convey all the flow around the auxiliary spillway without eroding it any further. So that's why we get back to that 200-foot wide width. Claire.
The flood maps that we are working on right now, I'm guessing different alternatives from different maps on flooding in those maps.
Absolutely, and that sort of gets back to the original slide about how Matanzas fits into the broader Central Sonoma watershed project. You've got flows coming down from Santa Rosa Creek and Matanzas. Both are critically important. Alternative 3 gets you the most storage on this leg of the watershed. So from that respect, it will reduce flooding through downtown Santa Rosa. It'll reduce the need or the size requirement at Matanzas Creek culvert. But really, you have to view that in combination with what may happen in the future as part of that other improvements at those other sites. But instead of accepting the existing conditions, which is much lower in terms of flood storage that was originally designed, this alternative 3 would bring you back up to that 100-year, 24-hour design storage event. Any other questions? Yes. Yeah, there is, and so I definitely refer you to the Plan EA. It provides a lot of information about the hydraulic modeling that was done, and so it provides inundation mapping pretty much from Matanzas, like I said, which is about 2 miles from here, all the way down to Willowside Road. You can see what the differences are and in what areas, what flood inundation is going to look like at where you're particularly interested. Let me see, what was the second part of your question? So just Yep. So regarding flows here at the golf course, I guess I can speak to kind of the performance of the existing principal spillway structure. So that principal spillway structure is probably caps at about 1,200 cubic feet per second. Even at that discharge, with it fully flowing, that actually initiates some flooding here through the golf course. And so you're not going to see a huge benefit maybe here at the golf course for those more frequent events. But for these larger events like the 25-year, the 50-year, the 100-year, that's where you'll really see a reduction, because that's when you'll see engagement of this entire flood pool and using it for flood storage. But those lower frequency events, as you'll see in the draft Plan EA and the supporting documents, you won't see a huge difference, primarily because we haven't proposed changing the diameter of the principal spillway. If we necked it down, if we made it smaller, then we could see additional, benefits for those lower frequency storms at the cost of the larger events. So we would be holding more water back, storing it to reduce flows down here for the 2 and the 5 and the 10 year. So the draft Plan A doesn't really consider impacts on groundwater primarily because we're really focused on event-specific hydrologic events. So we're not looking at long-term modeling of, yeah. And Matanzas is actually not permitted to permanently retain flow. So when a storm comes through, it fills up and it empties. Yeah. If we potentially could hold water, then maybe we'd have a large impact on groundwater. Oh, that's great. Oh. No, we're not. Yeah, and so Matanzas, it's a passive structure, so there isn't really any operational element. So we don't really have control over how much water gets through the reservoir. It's just an open weir. Once water reaches that weir elevation, it just starts pouring into that principal spillway structure. So there's not a gate or a knob that we turn that can potentially cut flows off. Yeah. All right, I'm pass over to Richard to describe the NEPA process.
As I mentioned earlier, the purpose of the need is the first part of the process. And then you go to the scope and you determine which agencies you're working with, partners you're working with, the public. You determine resource concerns that may, initial resource concerns, so you know what to expect, I guess. Then you look at your baseline conditions. As I mentioned earlier, you go through your alternatives, explore your alternatives, evaluate your alternatives, and then you get to your environmental consequences section. And that's what I'm going to talk about most in the next few minutes here. But environmental consequences are just your effects. So you look at your baseline conditions, you look at alternatives, and you figure out what the effects are. And then you mention how are we going to avoid effects, minimize effects in that section. So this kind of can carry into the consultation, coordination, and public participation. And then through the end of the process, you come to your alternatives, or your preferred alternative. So you use the process to find out what is the preferred alternative. We've obviously completed a draft plan EA. We've done internal review process within our CS. Now, obviously, again, we're in a public review period. So the environmental assessment is the type of document we're producing, because although there are some effects we're looking at, but they're not as, they would be considered less impactful or minor compared to what might be in a larger environmental impact statement. So just wanted to cover that. So there was a lot of different resource concerns to look at through the documents, and that'll take a lot of time, and you're of course welcome to go look through it. But considering time, I'm going to go through the resource concerns that would be to note, or the most relevant that we assessed. First, I want to explain that Aaron described 3 alternatives and explained how they're kind of different in certain ways. But as far as impacts, alternatives 1, 2, 3 are very similar in project area, activity, and impact. Therefore, the impacts of all 3 alternatives were combined into one effects evaluation to reduce redundancy. We also looked at the effects of not doing the project, so no action alternative. I'll just briefly talk about that towards the end of my slides here. So I'm going to basically summarize and focus on the effects of our action alternatives. So the first one that comes to mind is air quality. Anytime you're excavating or running machines for long periods, you will generate emissions. Every time you're excavating earth, doing ingress and egress and hauling, there's a chance to generate dust as well. So Sonoma County is a non-attainment for PM 2.5. PM 2.5 is like a mixture of emissions and dust particulate matter, and there's ozone. So we did an emissions calculation, and we found that the calculation was well below federal thresholds. So that's good. But we're also doing several different various measures to further reduce dust and other emissions. Some of these include measures some of these measures include wetting soil, especially if there's any dirt roads, speed limits when we're hauling, of course, and revegetating bare soil areas, and use of properly operating machines, using machines that are more efficient, so we're not producing as much emissions. Every time you excavate, there's a chance of impacting cultural historic resources. So our cultural resource specialists did thorough background review, on-site surveys, and identification of findings. And NRCS reviewed the findings and determined there would be no adverse effect. We also did a consultation, which we worked with the State Historic Preservation Officer and our applicable tribes, and they concurred that there would be no adverse effect to cultural resources. Still, though, we have a project follow-up measures, and you can see this in Appendix E6, that measures we can do in case we encounter unanticipated discoveries during construction. So for cultural resources, you could look in section 6.2.2 Plan EA for more details on this. Go ahead. Oh, I thought you were, sorry. I thought you were asking a question. Okay, next. So also habitat and vegetation. The action area includes several types of habitats. This includes, that can be disturbed in construction areas, sediment removal areas, equipment access, operation areas. We found that there are 36.2 acres of grassland and other uplands that could be affected or that would be disturbed. Approximately 5 acres of wetlands could be disturbed, and 6.9 acres of riparian habitat. Riparian habitat is the willows and cottonwoods that grow along the creek. So the sponsor, in response to this, has planned to reestablish through reseeding, replanting, and natural revegetation. So these efforts will reestablished most of the areas, but we have a few areas where reestablishment on site is not possible. So this is approximately 0.62 acres of wetlands and 0.3 acres of riparian habitat that might not be restorable. And so in response to that, the sponsor will obtain proper permits, and if needed, do compensatory mitigation on some of these areas that may not be restorable. And this would be done in coordination with various regulatory agencies. Water quality is also can be an issue because as we disturb uplands, there could lead to erosion and sedimentation. Use of machines in and around waterways could lead to discharge of pollutants into downstream areas. And so we're revegetating to reduce these effects. And once vegetation is established, that'll hold soil better, especially in the surrounding uplands. We also have dewatering measures that will be conducted, although I don't think we will probably work in water. But if there is water, we can do dewatering measures, spill avoidance measures, and the sponsor is also going to get a state stormwater pollution prevention plan. We'll establish that and implement it, and to further reduce effects that will come with many different water quality measures, basically. These are some of the permits you might know about or may know about, but basically these are all different permits to be obtained that have various water quality measures, and will be followed to reduce effects of water quality. There's also, we'll do our efforts to reduce or avoid impacts to wildlife. Again, this can include restoring some of the wildlife habitat areas, bringing the habitat back for wildlife. We'll also do pre-construction surveys and spatial temporal buffers for any nesting birds or roosting bats. Also in-channel dewatering and in-channel work measures and wildlife entrapment avoidance measures. So these can all be seen, if you're curious about these, they can all be found in table A1 for wildlife measures 1 through 5. Lastly, we have our measures to protect general wildlife, but we also did a thorough evaluation of threatened and endangered species, protected species. And we found that the project for almost all the species are to be a no effect because most species would not occur in the area of the project area, or the habitat is unsuitable for species, or our various avoidance measures would avoid those species. The only species that could occur in the area is the red-legged frog and some of the aquatic areas. But our biologists did a thorough evaluation of this and found that occurrence and effects are unlikely for this species. We also did when you have potential effects to endangered species, you do what's called a consultation with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So we carried out that consultation, and we concluded that effects would be unlikely. And in addition, Fish and Wildlife coordinated with us, and we agreed that we would follow. We basically have a programmatic agreement in this county and in 3 other counties with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And so that if we follow that, Fish and Wildlife basically concurs with our effect analysis. So it's a lot there, but you can review the Plan EA in section 6322 to find more detail. It's kind of hard to summarize all that. So you're welcome to look at that. That's my summary of the effects. There's a lot of it's hard to cover it all quickly, but like I said, you can look in the sections of the Plan EA if you want more detail. And these are basically for the action alternatives of doing dam rehabilitation alternatives. But there's also the no action alternative. And when you think of the effects of not doing anything, typically for most resource concerns, you have little to no effect. But when it comes to economic, social, safety, then our no action alternative has concerns, because there's a higher likelihood, if we don't do anything, there's a higher likelihood of future dam failure during flood or seismic events. There's lower flood storage and increased chance of flood damage. So this increases the likelihood of flood hazards, damage to downstream businesses, homes, and social facilities. So effects, basically, potential effects on economic, social, and threat to life. So as Aaron talked about alternative 3, we think this is the most suitable, for addressing these concerns here. In summary, we've released the draft Plan EA. Obviously, we're in public comment period. And just a reminder, if you want to make comments, it started July 6th, but you have August 25th to make those comments. Once we get the comments, we can address them, the public comments, in the revised Plan EA. And our goal is to finalize and publish the final EA and FONSI. We'll cut up FONSI because you attach that to the plan, showing that finding of no significant effect or impact. So that's our goals, and just wanted to cover, the environmental consequences of the project.
Give you a quick summary of what each alternative includes. Everything from whether sediment removal or seismic stability burns are included, all of them are included, alternatives 1 through 3, whether the spillway's lined, what's happening at the dam or the auxiliary spillway crests, what sort of flood storage you're then creating, and then the overall construction cost. So it probably deserves a little bit more discussion about the basis for the reason for why it's identified as the preferred alternative. So I'm going to quickly just step through that if it hasn't resonated through the presentation. First and foremost, all the alternatives have very similar impact areas. So alternatives 1 through 3, there wasn't a significant differentiator that said, hey, alternative 1 is like really not very impactful. Like maybe we should consider this one further. Same thing with alternative 2 and 3. They're all so very similar. So that on the environmental side, there wasn't a particular interest or need to consider a different alternative that had different environmental merits that would make it higher priority on the overall list. Just like alternatives 1 through 3, alternative 3 meets the purpose and need. It increases resilience to seismic events. And this is where things really start separating and making alternative 3 kind of the preferred alternative. Is first of all, it's most adaptable to future climate changes. So we don't expect rainfall to stay the same over the next 50 to 100 years. We expect it to increase. And so by developing that 100-year flood storage now, we're giving us a little bit of a margin for error to deal and cope with those changes that we expect. It also maximizes flood storage without impacting upstream structures. And that was one of the key things that came out of the draft Plan EA is it'd be great to have greater flood storage, but who are we going to have to move to do this? And alternative 3 makes it happen without having to move any structures. It's also just marginally more expensive than alternative 2. So, we're talking millions. What's another $2 million to go from 50 to 100-year flood protection? Of course, these are planning level estimates, so the numbers might change, but it wasn't substantially more expensive to develop and provide 100-year flood protection. Any questions on alternatives or the basis or why alternative 3 is identified as the preferred alternative? All right. Richard did already talk about the overall process, but again, it'd be great to just quickly touch base on where we've been and how we got to where we're at and what our next steps are. And 2020 is when this whole process started. We've gone through numerous government shutdowns, really affecting NRCS's ability to push this project forward. In April 2021, we started phase 2 of the project, which was doing an inventory and resource analysis. That included a public scoping process or period. That's also available on the rehab website if you want to check it out. Phase 3 included developing those alternatives, so stepping through those standard alternatives and then generating alternatives that would meet the purpose and need, so alternatives 1 through 3. Phase 4 included development and preparation of that planned environmental document, which in this case is a Plan EA. And then phase 5 is where we're at today. We've got that draft Plan EA out for public comment. I think the comment period goes from the 25th of July through the 25th of August. More information can be found on the website. And if all goes well, NRCS is hoping to finalize this Plan EA by end of November. And then the critical thing to really point out is if we get through this whole process, what this really does for Sonoma Water is it avails us the opportunity to seek additional design and construction funding for the project as it moves forward. NRCS will fund 100% of the project design after this. So if we get through the FLONSI and finalizing the Plan EA, we can move on to design. And then during construction, they'll actually pay for 65% of whatever the construction costs are. So it's really a great opportunity for Sonoma Water and NRCS to work collaboratively and actually rehabilitate an aging dam that needs repair. Any questions about the information that was presented here, timeline? All right, so I think I've answered quite a few questions today, but if there are any other questions, feel free to raise your hand. Hearing none, I would just say make sure you grab your comments, either drop them off at the door or you can go ahead and email them to comments@cawatersheds@usda.gov. Please go to the project website and you can see the deadlines for submitting comments. If you prefer, you can also send them via mail so long as they're postmarked by August 25th. And that concludes today's presentation.